Okay, so I think I have everyone admitted to the class that's sitting out there trying to get in. And hang on just a minute. Now let's do that again. I think I have everyone who's in queue waiting to be admitted to the class admitted now. And so let's go ahead and get started. I've got the recorder on. And again, I'm Randy Kearns, your professor for the HCM3030 course. And tonight we want to go over specifically the IRB process and talk a little bit about research ethics and why the IRB process came about. So actually, what I really want to start with tonight is to talk about a couple of things. I've been working on grading this afternoon. I'm not finished with all of the submissions as of yet from Sunday night, but let me kind of give you some feedback. So, sorry, I had somebody else show up. So just a couple of things. First of all, about, I don't know, about 75% of the submissions are on target. You've identified good sources, and you're doing a good analysis. For the other 25%, let me be sure and talk about a couple of things. Again, from a peer review standpoint, if it says blog, chances are it's not peer reviewed. If it says USA Today, it's not peer reviewed. If it says the Heritage Foundation or KKR, it's probably not peer reviewed. Look for a DOI. The digital object identifier code is typically a symbol that it has been recorded in a peer-reviewed journal. And again, be sure and use the indexing search engines that we've talked about. If you're using the one at the University of New Orleans, there is a place to select peer-reviewed. Be sure to select that in your search. Again, I'm not trying to be harsh, but you need 15 peer-reviewed articles for your paper. You can have as many as you want. You can have 40 resources. You can have 40 other total sources, but that means 25 of them don't have to be peer-reviewed. And if you've got something from USA Today or the Heritage Foundation or KKR, those are all good additional sources, but they can't be a part of your first 15. Again, if it says the word blog in it, chances are it's not peer-reviewed. If it does not have a digital identifier code, a digital object identifier code, it's a DOI. If it doesn't have a DOI, chances are it's not peer-reviewed. It doesn't mean it won't be, but it's less likely to be. Be sure and double space your work. One student realized that later and sent me their updated assignment with double spacing, and I'm okay with that, and I'll go back in and substitute a grade when that sort of thing happens. So again, if you've made a mistake and you see that something was amiss after you submitted it, go ahead and send it to me as an email attachment. Just be sure and remind me if I don't use it as the replacement grade, but in most cases I'll pick it up as I'm doing grading. And as I said, I'm about halfway through the assignments from Sunday night right now. Again, be sure to double space your work. Be sure that your word count is sufficient. And I've set the threshold at 250 words per article, but that should be a sufficient number of words to adequately discuss what's in your article. If it's 150 or 200, chances are between the number of words that's in the citation itself, that's probably not going to give you a sufficient number of words to adequately discuss or describe what's in your article. So again, the minimum is 250. I realize some of you have gone to 350 and 400 words per article. Again, those numbers are fine. I just, again, the ceiling is I've said about 350. I don't really care what the ceiling is, but the floor is 250. If you're less than 250 words, there will be a point deduction. Same way with APA formatting. We've talked a lot about APA formatting, and yet I'm still getting stuff that's single spaced and in some cases does not include the reference at all. It tells me maybe the headline of the article, but not giving me any other information about where the article is located. It needs to be more than that. So again, the annotated bibliography format that we've gone over is really what you need to use. Again, I've tried to be careful and not substantially penalizing you for those numbers. But again, we're several weeks into this. Next week is our 4th set of annotated bibliographies. By that point, we should be getting it right. And I'm a little bit surprised I'm still having to go over this stuff. So now let's go ahead and pivot and talk about Institutional Review Board and why it's important. What are the key pieces and what's happened along the way that's caused this to be such an issue. Again, because of the nature of the work that we're doing, we're not going to submit for an IRB, but just understand any significant research that you do in your future career will include an IRB. And that's why it's important for me to be sure and talk about what the Institutional Review Board is and what's the basis for it. So a part of this goes back to, I've given you a couple of examples of when research has gone poorly, whether it's the Willowbrook experiments or the Milgram experiment or the Tuskegee experiment. All of those are great examples of, at some point, maybe well-intended people doing some pretty horrific things. And so that's my point. It's not just a matter of having good intentions, although I would argue that the Tuskegee experiment, at least early on, was probably well intended. Later on was absolutely draconian, and to the point that I was surprised somebody or several somebodies weren't prosecuted for what they did. It was absolutely criminal. But all of this has kind of driven what's become the Research Act of 1974 and why that needed to exist. We'll talk about federal regulation as it relates to human subjects, and then we'll talk about the Belmont Report. 3 key pieces of the Belmont Report: respect for persons, beneficence, and justice. And I've got slides on those later, and we'll talk about those in more detail. And then what's the requirement for human research training for every investigator? So at UNO, the minimum standard is something called a city certification, CITI. Again, if you wind up in a master's program or you wind up doing more advanced research, you'll need to complete city training. If we did anything here that was a little bit more involved, we would need to do city training. But it's basically reinforcing some of the key pieces of part of what we'll call the Belmont Report, but some other pieces as well. How an investigator has responsibilities associated with the IRB, particularly as it relates to human subjects. And then there's also standards if the subjects being investigated or part of the research aren't human, but there's also concerns in terms of how we treat animals or how we treat other sentient beings that may be a part of our research. And then what type of consequences may be out there if, again, later on, if you wind up in more specific research and you don't obtain an IRB. I'm currently involved in a fairly substantial research project involving paramedics back in my home state of North Carolina. And a part of what we're going to do is completely blinded. It's Uh, we won't know who received the survey. The people who completed the survey won't know who the researchers were that did the analysis, and the people involved in the control mechanism have a blinding mechanism as well, so that they don't know exactly who's receiving the survey. And then when they get the results back, they come back in aggregate. And the whole point is, even with all of that, I still need to, and I'm working an IRB through our IRB system here at UNO to get that. It winds up being an IRB waiver, but it still means I took the research project before the Institutional Review Board, and they reviewed it and decided to sign off on it. So what is research? So in terms of the definition, systematic investigation, testing or evaluation designed to develop and contribute to generalizable knowledge. What does that really mean? It's helping us. In some cases, it's designing an experiment. In some cases, it's designing a test, so that we learn more about why people do some of the things they do. The research project I just mentioned, we did a similar project several years ago to ask paramedics what their feelings were, what their beliefs were related to the flu vaccine. And then did they in fact get the flu vaccine each year? And if they did, was it because they thought it was a good idea? Or was it because they were required to get a flu vaccine because of their job? There are a lot of people who work in the healthcare world who have certain vaccination requirements. When I worked in a direct patient care setting, I had to have a hepatitis B vaccine, and then the myriad of the other standard vaccines, the MMR. But the point is to be sure that if I was interacting with patients on a regular basis, I had a much broader obligation to be vaccinated. Again, depending on where you may wind up working in a healthcare system may depend on to what extent you need to be fully vaccinated. But I would tell you, just in terms of just understanding the science, I get vaccinated for anything that's relevant to what I need. As an example, I've, at least before the pandemic, I do a lot of international travel. And so, yes, I've been vaccinated for pneumonia, the initial vaccine and the follow-up vaccine. I've been vaccinated for shingles. I've been vaccinated, all of my historical vaccines in some extent have been titered. I've actually had the smallpox vaccine. And all of that reflects the fact that the one way that we've understood how to manage viruses in the past has been through vaccination. Sometimes it helps us through research to connect back to why people today are in some cases reluctant to use a vaccine. Again, if you spend a little bit of time looking back 75 to 100 years, you'll understand just how dramatically different our world was, or the world was in the United States and around the world when vaccines did not exist. And so again, a part of the research for that project and a lot of other projects, I'm sure, is to, again, try and understand why humans make some of the decisions that they make. And so let's kind of move into key terms specific as it relates to the IRB. So again, I've talked about research in human subjects. The Belmont report produced 3 significant findings. And the Belmont report was released in 1979. We'll cover those 3 pieces in just a minute. Again, the respect for persons, beneficence, and justice. But all of these things kind of fell behind previous examples of human research that in some cases there were no boundaries. the Nuremberg Code of 1949 reflected how Nazi scientists had conducted extensive experimentation on human subjects that were Jews. And because they did not see Jews as in some cases they were treated as subhuman, it allowed them to create some distance in how they felt about how they treated them. And so the Nuremberg Code was to try and help us understand that's wrong in a million ways. But that became the basis. And then moving forward, 20 years, 25 years was the Declaration of Helsinki. And the whole point to that was to, again, further refine and further identify the importance of respect for people, respect for their right to make decision, respect for their right to consent to be a part of, or say, I don't want to be a part of a research project. And then 15 years later, the Belmont Report that we'll spend a little bit more time going over the details of. And all of that kind of rolls up into the IRB process and what we know of today as the IRB process. And the IRB, again, is the Institutional Review Board. The best way to think about the Institutional Review Board is usually there's multiple people on a panel who are not involved in your research, but will objectively look at your research and look for pitfalls and look for design flaws, but also look for ways to help you improve it before you get the green light to start your research. Or in some cases, the IRB is a hard stop and they'll tell you, we can't do that. That's not what we do here. Or the IRB process, somewhere along the way, will step in and say, you're not doing what you said you would do, so we're going to pull the plug on the research project. And so now let's talk about the Belmont Report. Again, respect for persons, beneficence, and justice. So let's look at these three principles individually. In terms of respect for persons, people have the right to self-determination. How do we assure that participation is voluntary? And then is there any type of special considerations, particularly for people who are vulnerable? And although the slide specifically talks about people with cognitive disabilities and prisoners and institutionalized persons, you know, I'll show you some examples a little later on of how this has occurred a couple of times in VA hospitals after the Belmont Report, primarily because they had what they felt like was a captivated audience, and in some cases there were cognitive impairments, and so they didn't consent, and yet research was conducted. And so again, we have to recognize that people have a right to say no. People need to be capable of saying yes or no and understanding what yes or no means. And some people will tell you, well, you know, when this came about, it substantially changed some of the things we could do in research and really limit some of the things we can do in research. And that is true. But it also helps keep people from harm, which is more important than some of the things we can learn through experimentation. Again, I get back to the Nuremberg Code and their retrospective look at the scientific data that came out of the Nazi research involving people who were Jewish. And it gave us really extraordinary pieces of science that we would have otherwise never known. But ethically and morally, there's a really hard line that you just don't want to cross. And even if you know that information, or even if that information is available, there's significant debate in the scientific community that should we even use it, even though we know it's true, or even though we know it was obtained through these horrendous circumstances. To what extent do we want to use that information? I'm talking about, you know, temperature sensitivities and pain thresholds and things that are just absolutely cruel and unusual, but yet something that was done in the 1940s and late 1930s under the heading of scientific research. Beneficence is, again, getting back to putting somebody at risk, reasonable to the anticipated benefits. And the best way to think about beneficence is, would I take an experimental drug? Well, in most cases, I'm going to be reluctant to take an experimental drug unless something changes. And let me give you one example. So Duke University, and I used to work at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. We sometimes have a huge rivalry with Duke, but it has more to do with basketball than it does with scientific research. And with scientific research, we worked together and had a really collaborative relationship. And one of the things that they were doing, so one of the challenges with cancer is when a cancer cell grows, it has the ability to mask itself and hide itself from the body's autoimmune system. And so there's several particularly nasty tumors. All cancerous tumors are not good, but some are particularly difficult to deal with. And one is a tumor that occurs in the brain, and it grows quite quickly. It's called a glioblastoma, and people with a glioblastoma diagnosis before the Duke research typically had a lifespan of between 3 and 6 months from the time of diagnosis to the time of death. And so what the Duke researchers realized they could do, they could take a gene editing device called CRISPR and alter the effects of the poliovirus, and then inject the poliovirus into the tumor. And by injecting the virus into the tumor, now mind you, it's a much weaker version, suddenly it broke down that cloaking, so to speak, that the tumor was able to admit to keep itself from being detected by the body's autoimmune system. And because now the body's autoimmune system could see the poliovirus and actually see this tumor as well, the body's autoimmune system suddenly attacked it in a fairly elaborate way. In some cases, people, instead of dying at 3 months or 6 months, are now living to close to a year. In a couple of cases, they've been cured. Before this occurred, a glioblastoma was a known terminal irreversible illness with no good outcomes. And so I get back to beneficence. If I'm the patient who I've been told, and they confirm that I have a glioblastoma, and I'm provided with the patient education that says, you know, without treatment, the only thing I can tell you is to get your affairs in order. The typical lifespan is 3 to 6 months. But we have this experimental treatment where we're going to put a needle in a tumor that's in your brain, and we're going to inject a altered version of the poliovirus so that your body's autoimmune system can attack it. That still sounds pretty bizarre. So I'm going to let you stick a needle in through my skull and into my brain and into a tumor, and so that you can inject poliovirus into my brain. That really doesn't sound smart, and yet all of those things come together to, in some cases, allow people. There are a couple of examples of people being cured from their glioblastoma and now alive 5, 6, 7 years after that occurred. It doesn't work that way for everyone, and that again reminds us that we don't clearly understand what's happening. But the whole point to beneficence is to help people understand that there's a risk associated with some of these extraordinary scientific research situations that are going on, and that would certainly be one of them. And I don't know all of the research that's going on, but it wouldn't surprise me that they may have approached several patients who said, you know, I think I'll pass. I know what I have. I know what I'm going to live with. Now I know what I'm going to die with, and let me be at peace with that. But I'm also sure that if I didn't have a glioblastoma, I'm not going to let you stick a needle into my skull and into my brain and inject poliovirus. But it does change the fact if I know what I have and I've been educated to what I have and I've been told what the potential research opportunities are. And as I mentioned before, not everybody has survived. And in fact, most people have not survived. They've lived longer, but they've not survived 2, 3, 5 years. Several people have, but most of them have not. And so it tells us that more research needs to be done. But in each of those situations, it does come back to the beneficence of it. Justice really gets back to, again, this equal distribution of what's the benefit of the research and who should bear the burdens. How do we balance this? And a part of justice, it includes how we select people, how we select subjects, or how we select people to be a part of our research study. And you know, when you look at Nuremberg, or you look at Willowbrook, or you look at the Tuskegee experiments, in each of those cases, they selected a group of people that at some level they did not treat them as, or did not see them as, a fellow human being at some point. Now, you could argue early into the Tuskegee experiment that was quite ethical and quite reasonable, and a lot of things they were doing was correct. But at a point that they had the cure for syphilis and yet continued on their path of not treating it appropriately, that's where it completely went off the rail, in my opinion. And that's, again, that's where people allowed themselves to see others as less than a fellow human being, just as the Nazis treated the Jews in a lot of their research. And so again, the importance is to be sure that whether it's prisoners or people with cognitive behavior disorders, not everyone is able to see, understand, and hear things appropriately. And so we have a balance. We have an obligation to be sure that we don't do something to someone without them understanding what the pros and the cons are of that being done. So again, from the historical perspective, I've mentioned the Nuremberg Code before. Again, there's an enormous amount of information that came from the Nazi research. In some cases, they were extraordinary researchers and extraordinary scientists. But it's really safe to say that they had very few boundaries of how they viewed their Jewish prisoners, and therefore how they saw them or didn't see them as fellow human beings, and therefore allowed themselves to do some of the things they did. The Helsinki Accord was really about being sure that what's done on the World Health stage also doesn't mean that whenever some new research is ready to be rolled out, we don't immediately fly off to a country where people are very poor and not educated and not capable of understanding some of the research that's being done. And so sometimes you will see that, but um, through the WHO and through other organizations, there is a balance that has to be struck to show that there is beneficence, there is justice of what's being done in the communities where that's being done. As an example, Ebola vaccine research is being done right now in several countries in Africa. And so a lot of work had to go into how that was set up to be sure that they're not taking advantage of people, but at the same time, the front line of Ebola is the Democratic Republic of the Congo and several other countries, Cote d'Ivoire, but several other countries are primarily on the Atlantic coast of Africa. And so as they're setting up that research and performing their studies as it relates to Ebola vaccination, a part of that is to also be sure that there's benefit with minimal harm, and the benefit impacts the people that are really on the front line of that disease. Again, it's primarily located in the Atlantic coastal area of Africa, but the whole point to providing a vaccine there is also to help conduct the research there, and hopefully a vaccine is produced that could be used in other places. But the primary benefit is the people that are primarily exposed, and that primarily includes those people there on the Atlantic coast of Africa. And then the Belmont report, again, a lot of the Belmont report cites the Tuskegee syphilis study, and as I said before, if you, well, I think I've got it on my next slide. Yes, so if you go back and look at the timeline of the Tuskegee syphilis study, there was actually good intention to begin with. The intent was to help people and understand treatments and outcomes related to syphilis. But then by the 1940s, certainly by the mid-1940s, we had an effective treatment for syphilis. We knew what that should be, and what we should have done, what anyone involved in that research should have done at that time, is whoever was identified to not be getting the effective treatment should be given the effective treatment. And at that point, the study should have been stopped. And yet it wasn't, and actually it went on into the 1960s. And I don't have an explanation for that other than that was absolutely horrendous. Nazi war crimes the same way. I mean, and human radiation experiments, Nazi war crimes really went over into exposure to radiation, exposure to different chemical weapons, exposure to extreme pain and heat. Again, just some really horrific things. The Nazi war crimes, again, were probably the most extraordinary of what should have never been done. But again, help remind us and hopefully help ground us into what is safe and effective research and what can never occur again. The Willowbrook study shows us how sometimes well-intended researchers can take advantage of people with impaired cognitive behavior and people who are domiciled in a certain location and can't really escape. Project Camelot, I don't remember right offhand. Let me go ahead and move forward to the Milgram study and the Johns Hopkins cases and MK Ultra, and I'll actually come back to, so the Milgram study, if I'm not mistaken, I gave you a link to that earlier. If you've not seen that, it really would be worth, there's a short 10-minute version of it. It would really be worth your time to understand how influential people can be because of their standing, their stature, how they're dressed, how they conduct themselves, and how they can make people do things that they wouldn't otherwise do. The Milgram study, again, couldn't be done today, but and fortunately didn't harm anybody, but from an ethical standpoint was completely unethical, and it did give us insight into how people behave, but it certainly is deception at its either worst or at its finest, but it at least helps us understand how things should not be done. The Johns Hopkins cases, I've got a couple of them on other slides, and I'll come back to an MK Ultra. Again, I think I gave you both a little bit of information on it, as well as George Clooney made a somewhat funny movie about it. Well, they attempted to be funny. The trailer for the movie is about 2.5 minutes, and I think that's the only funny parts in it. But it is a little bit disturbing in the fact that at some point we really believed that we could use ESP to telepathically intercept what other people were thinking, or we could cause our vehicle, or we could walk through a wall, or we could, anyway, it was a military experiment. It was a military project. It was funded for several years. It was based at Fort Bragg. And again, it gives you an idea of just how unusual some things have been at some point in the last 50 years of our life. So this is a little bit more about the Tuskegee syphilis study. Again, early on, I think there were good intentions with this, but at the point that they developed at the time this was developed in 1932, there was no known cure for syphilis. So it does make reasonable sense that you would identify a target audience. Again, I can't imagine why you would identify people of a specific race, because again, if you're trying to do broad allocation of what your findings are, you really need to have broad representation of your sample population, and they didn't do that. The other piece that, again, where this really took a dark turn was when penicillin was first understood to be an effective treatment for syphilis, and the drug became available in the 1940s. There were people who were allowed to continue with syphilis to their death. And syphilis does have long-term chronic problems that it causes, including senility. And so, it's disappointing that that research was done. It's certainly disappointing that research was done under the name of the U.S. public health system. And it's also disappointing that it lasted as long as it did. So there are federal regulations as it relates to human subjects. I've identified this. I don't know that that's terribly important, but I do want to go back specifically to the Research Act, because UNO policies and any hospital that you will work in, any university that you'll be a part of, even a community college, has an institutional review board. And that IRB is guided by the Research Act of 1974. And then some of the prevailing principles include the Belmont Report and the basis of the Belmont Report. UNO policies, we observe 45 CFR 46. And so if you're not sure about a project, again, because of what we're doing, I will steer us away from needing an IRB. But it is important for you to understand that we have an IRB process at UNO. And if you wind up in a master's program, you will need to have an IRB, at least for a letter of declination. And then rationale for federal regulation. And again, it goes over the key pieces associated with conduct of research. and it does go into a little bit of the history of subject abuse, but and exploitation, and how we need to be sure we have informed consent. We don't wind up with coercion and deception, just in helping people understand the difference between what is research and what is treatment or therapy, or withholding treatment or therapy. Who's funding the research? Is there something to be gained by a certain organization funding the research? And then other reasons associated with it. As it becomes more complex or more people get involved in the research, it is important to be sure to sometimes reevaluate what's going on. I can tell you, I've not been involved in the research process at UNO enough to know if we have hard stops. I'm sure we do. At my last university, or at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, we had a hard stop every year, meaning we had to briefly halt what we were doing and resubmit to the institutional review board, and they would do a quick review to be sure that nothing had changed in our procedures to give us a green light to continue. But we had a one-day timeout to be sure that we had that pause, there was a review, and then we could continue what we were doing. So what I want to do now is the last, I don't know, 20 or so slides, we'll go over types of research that gives us an idea of how things have gone awry. This is at Duke. So as I mentioned before, where I worked before, we had a good relationship with Duke, and typically they did a very good job. But this is one particular case where certainly they didn't. This occurred there before I worked at UNC. But it does remind you of just how substantial the punishment can be. It did threaten a significant portion of their federal grants. The physician involved in this particular research was lost his license, at least in North Carolina, for a period of 1 year. There were a number of things that created fallout from this, but the whole point was, and I'll show you Johns Hopkins in just a minute, even the best services, the best systems, some of the best known research universities have made mistakes, and these research rules are in place to keep us within the boundaries of what's legal, but to also remind us if we stray outside of what's legal, that there's substantial penalty involved in it. This is the Johns Hopkins example. They had a death of a healthy volunteer participant in an asthma study. And again, the whole point to this is to be sure that from a beneficent standpoint, what's the benefit to people participating in the study? You know, I will say people who participate in studies in many cases receive a small amount of money that's a reflection of compensating you for your time and effort or your gas money. In some research, some of the latest research that I've seen, they would pay people $120 for every time they came in for a visit. And the whole point to that was, you know, $120 is not a lot of money, but at the same time, it's to compensate you for your time. Well, $120 for some people, and there was a time in my life when I was in your shoes as a student, $120 was an awful lot of money. So yeah, I would have probably participated in a study if somebody would have given me $120 every time I came in. And the whole point to that is to be sure that the reward is not done to the detriment of the participant in the study. And so again, you always have to have that balance of, you need to be sure that there is some type of reward. That's the whole point to beneficence. But at the same point, that balance shouldn't swing in such a way that people are coerced into volunteering for something without being told all of the potential pitfalls, all of the potential unfavorable outcomes that could occur. Penn State had an 18-year-old who died involving a gene therapy study. And again, it's because they didn't do the type of work they needed to do, the type of what's called bench science, before they converted it to human research studies. And so again, failing to fully inform the FDA of what they were doing, and certainly failing to provide study participants of what the potential adverse effects was. This was substantial, and again, it cost a young man his life. Other places, and I don't know that we need to continue to go through all of these, but the whole point to this is to understand that you have to function within the guidelines of what's safe. You have to be sure people are fully informed. You need consent. In most cases, you need signed consent. And in most cases, the signed consent needs to be a witness consent unless they're an adult. And again, it's a part of understanding the nuances associated with the research. So I've got several more here. New York University stopped several studies after ethical violations. University of California at San Diego. This was considered a well-respected physician who had a number of research projects that were funded, but also had poor documentation, didn't do a great job of documenting and keeping records of some of the research that he was doing. And it was determined that it was necessary to make a hard stop with some of his research because of some of these findings. And then again, another one at the VA, just a reminder that the challenge with the VA population is sometimes you're dealing with a population, a patient population that may feel trapped. They may feel like they don't have any other health care to turn to. And so you have to be incredibly careful with not trying to obtain consent in a way that people feel coerced into participating in the study. So as far as the IRB process goes, the last couple of slides I want to go over is really kind of a step-by-step process of the IRB itself. There's a common training program that we all complete. If you do wind up conducting research where you need an IRB, you'll need to complete the city program research training. It's a self-directed program, and University of New Orleans is a participant in the city program. Most universities participate in the city program, and even if you completed your, let's say you completed your master's at UNO, you completed your city training, and then you decided you wanted to obtain a PhD and you went to University of Alabama, Birmingham, chances are there are over 300 universities that participate in the city program. So chances are your training transfers to the next organization. So investigator responsibilities, what are you designing? What do you do? What's your recruitment method? The PI is a principal investigator. That means if I'm the one that's overseeing the research, I'm referred to as the principal investigator. I may have other investigators, co-investigators, people participating in the research, but the PI is ultimately responsible for the research being done. And so the PI is primarily the one communicating with the IRB committee and getting the application done. The IRB staff reviews the application. There's again, from an application standpoint, what are the key pieces that are a part of it? what type of criteria has to be evaluated. And the University of New Orleans uses a very similar process to most other universities. And again, a part of it is to compare the criteria associated with the IRB with the Belmont principles and the Code of Federal Enforcement or Federal Regulation, the CFR, associated with human research studies. And then if the application is approved, once you get the letter approving it, or once you get that notice of approval, you can at least begin to start your process. Again, it's incredibly important not to start your actual research until you get IRB approval. In some cases, you may not get approval. You may be asked for additional revisions, where you need to go back in and change maybe the sample size or how you're going to recruit subjects. But the whole point to that is to get feedback from the IRB. And then renewals, again, so we had a hard stop where I worked before. We had a hard stop every year for 1 day. And the hard stop was to, again, that safety stop to stand back and look at what you were doing and to be sure that everything complied with the standards. And then a comprehensive review every 5 years is the common rule, and 5 years is at UNO. And then what are the investigator responsibilities? Periodic reporting, and particularly reporting if there's a violation of protocol, or if there's a deviation from protocol, or some type of unexpected problems. And then understand that there may be an audit of what you're doing, and that's again the IRB just overseeing your data and looking at your data analysis process. We've talked about this. It is important to understand that unacceptable research practice could wind up in penalties for who's responsible for the research, the principal investigator, as well as the student conducting the research. So, you know, if you're doing the research as a part of your master's thesis, it needs to be exactly consistent with whatever your IRB approval is. And if there's some deviation from that, or if you start before you get approval, just understand that there may be, you may not be able to complete your degree, you may be suspended from the university for an extended period of time. There are true consequences both for the university and for you, and for the principal investigator if there's a failure to be consistent with and compliant with what you said you would do as a part of the IRB process. And that pretty much wraps up where we are. At this point, let me go ahead and stop and ask, do you have any questions? So I mentioned this when we got started, and let me go ahead and say it one more time as we're wrapping up. I've had a couple of situations over the last couple of weeks where people would ask questions, and they were asking questions about something that we had spent a lot of time talking about in class. And the main thing I would remind you is if you can't make it to class at the time we have class, I post these recordings so that you can review them. It's a bit annoying to answer questions that we've already discussed and we've already answered. So I would just encourage you to just understand, on my side of the YouTube channel, I can see how many people have viewed the video, and I can see how long you viewed the video. So if you're not viewing the video and then skipping some steps and just deciding, well, I don't know what this means, so I'm gonna ask without reviewing all of the information that's been provided, that's not ideal. So please don't do that. And then again, last but not least, to again talk about your sources. Next 2 weeks, 3 additional sources this week and next week, as it as their annotated bibliographies. Again, be sure they're peer reviewed. If you're not sure if it's peer reviewed, one thing I would ask you to do is to look for that DOI number. The DOI number is typically, that object identifier code typically tells you that it's from some type of a peer reviewed journal. If you're using the University of New Orleans search through the library, just be sure and click the box for peer reviewed journals. Or use PubMed. Any of those search engines will help you. If you're on Google Scholar or you're on ResearchGate, just understand, be sure to look for that DOI number, because there may be stuff on there that doesn't tie back to a DOI number. And if it's not tied back to a DOI number, it's not peer reviewed. Chances are it's not peer reviewed. And if it's not peer reviewed, it doesn't count as one of your 15 annotated bibliographies. So I had several people turn in 3, what I would say are good sources last week, but they're not peer reviewed, and so they won't count towards your 15 annotated bibliographies. So you can have as many sources as you want. You know, you can have 30, 40, 50, whatever you want, but you have to have at least 15 that are peer reviewed, and that needs to be in your annotated bibliographies each week. I hope that was helpful. Certainly, if you have questions, send me an email, but don't send me an email if you haven't already viewed the video. Be sure and view the video. And then if you still have questions, of course, I'll answer your question, but it can be a bit challenging to answer the same thing several times. And with that, I don't have anything else. So if you have a question, be sure and ask it now. Otherwise, I appreciate your time this evening. And just as a reminder, we will be in the classroom next Tuesday night at 6 p.m. And that's all I have for tonight. Any questions?
Yes, sir. So just because it's from Google Scholar or ResearchGate, that doesn't mean it has a DOI number. We need to look for that separately.
You should, yes.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah.
And does the DOI number usually show up in the little patch of information given on Google Scholar or ResearchGate? Like when it lists it, I believe I saw a DOI number in the little link type thing.
Yeah, in most cases it does. The one common index system that's out there for peer reviewed, for most what's considered peer reviewed articles, is that digital object identifier code. Okay. So okay. Yeah. If yes, you sir. Don't, thank you. Yeah, if you don't see a DOI, I won't tell you it's not peer reviewed, but I will tell you it's far less likely to be peer reviewed.
Okay. Okay. Perfect.
Sure.
Thank you.
Sure. Sure. Are there other questions? Okay, so at this point, I'm going to wrap it up, and I will. I'll post the video in the morning. So if you have any questions and you want to go back over it, you're welcome to do that. Or if you know somebody who missed the class tonight, again, just be sure and remind them that it'll be available in the morning. Otherwise, let me stop sharing and say I'm glad I got to see you. You all have a good night.